Hey, here we go. I think we've had a bunch of names show up on my screen, so I think we've got this thing kicked off. If you can hear and see me, just and see my screen there, it says mastering your autofocus. Just make sure that do me a favor and type in the chat or the Q&A, and just so I know that you can hear me before we officially get started. All right, I think we're good to go. Got a few people answering there. Well, welcome. I hope everyone had a productive and enjoyable 4th of July holiday. I know I did. Kind of low key for me. We just hung out with the family and our community fireworks show that we have near Bonham, Texas. Bonham's the county seat of the county where I live. They have a big fireworks show out by the lake every year and out north of town. And from where we live in the country, we can go to the hillside there on, I've got 2 properties here. On one of my properties, we can go up to the top of the hill and watch those fireworks go off and be out here away from the crowds and not have to fight the crowds when you're going there or leaving. So it was great. Spent the time with my kids, my brother, my mom and dad. We had the whole gang up there, some neighbors' kids, and it was fantastic. So I hope everyone else's holiday was fantastic as well. But now it's time to get back to work. Thanks everyone for being here. Again, the title of today's webinar is Mastering Your Autofocus. My name is Russell Graves, and I'm coming to you live from Hackberry Farm, which is north of Dodge City, Texas. And it's always great to be here on these webinars. I'm pretty excited right now. I'm on the countdown, not tomorrow, but today's Tuesday. On Friday morning, I get on a plane and I head to Alaska. It's time for the bear season to start in Alaska for everybody. I look at some of the names on the list in today's webinar, and I noticed that there's a few of you guys that'll be either up there with me and Russ Nordstrand on the Alaska Uncharted trip, and there'll be others. I think it's Ben who will be in Katmai. Ben and Kenton, I think, maybe in Katmai this coming up week with the bears there. So whichever bear destination you're going on, I can assure you it's going to be a fantastic one. I'm pretty excited. We're Russ and I have been talking behind the scenes about the whole setup there on the one we're doing, and it's going to be a pretty phenomenal one for the book. So I'm excited. You are going to get to, if you're going on the Bears Uncharted trip with me, you'll get to meet another member of the Graves family. My 17-year-old son's going to accompany me up there and go on a trip of a lifetime. So, oops, I went too far. Sorry about that. Hang on. Let me go back one. There we go. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on the Mastering Your Autofocus. As I go through this, as always, just again, make sure I want this to be a dialogue, not a monologue. So if you have any questions, make sure you pop them in there and I'll answer the questions as I go along. Or if you have any comments, not just questions. You know, one of the things that I constantly talk about in photography, it's like playing a game of golf. You know, the best golfers in the world play the game knowing they can never master it, but they play nonetheless. And so that's how photography is for me. You know, I pick up my camera almost every day and I use it knowing that I'll never master it, but hopefully I can pick up a technique or a tip or two along the way that helps me get better in my game as time goes along. And that's kind of the spirit of this Mastering Your Autofocus. This isn't an end-all, be-all, and your pictures will not be 100% in focus after you watch this webinar, but I've got a few tips in here for you to think about, and maybe you can pick up one or two that will help you go from one level to the next in terms of, again, mastering your autofocus. So this is my quote I put in here today. Autofocus may be the single biggest innovation that impacted wildlife and nature photography. You know, I've been shooting pictures for a long time. I am 51 now, and I've got my first camera when I was 16 and started seriously taking pictures then. And back then it was an old Vivitar camera, had screw mount lenses that I'd have to put my hands up here. It seemed like it'd take forever to screw the lenses on that camera, but it was all manual. It was manual exposure. It just had a plus and a minus in the meter and a little needle that you would have to get it in the center when it was properly exposed. You'd have to change your settings, and it was all manually focused. And, you know, shooting that on film, I did okay. I mean, it was a good way to learn. But in 1987, I was 17 years old, and autofocus came out. I think Minolta was the first company to have autofocus in their cameras. And I didn't get them immediately, but a few years later when I had the money, I bought some autofocus cameras. And as slow and cumbersome as they were, it still helped out a lot in certain situations. Now, fast forward to 2021, and autofocus in the ensuing years has done amazing things. And it's a great tool to use, and it's become innovative because there's pictures now like birds in flight. None of us would have ever been able to do that had we been manually focusing. We could have got some pictures in focus, but the sheer magnitude of pictures that you'll keep when you're using autofocus, you just never could have done it. And that's so that the autofocus has been a big game changer in photography. And so one of the first things you need to think about is understand that different lenses behave differently with your camera. So it's not, at least on my cameras, it's not one size fit all. So in other words, my 500 millimeter lens behaves differently than, say, my 50 millimeter lens does. You know, my 50 millimeter lens focuses a lot more accurately, a lot quicker than my 500 millimeter lens does. My 500 millimeter lens will still focus fast, but not as fast as that 50 millimeter lens. And I'm not an optical physicist. There's some differences in the way those lenses are constructed. There's some differences in how many lenses that lens has inside of it. So there's all those things into play that helps your camera determine sensitivity to the autofocus points that are held within the camera. Now, let me give one caveat. Things are changing pretty quickly when it comes to mirrorless cameras. So, and I've definitely used mirrorless cameras, and I'll probably make the switch, but most of this conversation is more centered around DSLR cameras, that it seems like, at least on backcountry journey trips, most people are still using the DSLRs right now as opposed to mirrorless. So that's what this whole presentation is geared towards, is DSLRs. But again, I've got an 85 millimeter 1.2 lens that doesn't focus as fast as the 50 or the 500 millimeter lens. So when if I understand the different capabilities of my lenses and what they're likely to achieve and how close they'll focus and all those other things that I need to know about that lens, if I take the time to learn each intricacy of each individual lens, my autofocus becomes more predictable and better, and I'm able to get better results time after time. Now, here's the hard part. You got to think about the Pythagorean Theorem. And I know you got on this webinar and you're thinking to yourself, wait a second, I didn't sign up to do any math. Well, there's no math involved, but it all has to do with the practical knowledge of understanding how to point your camera and what it does when you move your camera around. Now, I'm a big fan of using on Canon cameras, they've got a mode called one shot, and that's just, it'll focus once and then it beeps at you, and then it stops until you push the button again and make it focus again. Now, I learned the hard way that I would focus on something using my center focusing point and I'd recompose. Well, just that little recomposition, if you think about the distance between you and the thing you're focusing on, if you move your camera so slightly off that initial plane of focus, then it changes that line or that leg of that triangle that you're creating between you and the subject, and the sight lines you have. Once you move your camera just ever so slightly, it changes the distance, and when it changes the distance, it changes the focus. So I've tried to approximate this. So a lot of times what I used to do is I would focus on the eye with the center focusing point, and then I would move the recompose in the subject. You can see, give me 1 second. Let me turn something on here. I don't know if you can see that or not on the screen, but the center focusing point, I'd focus on the eye, then I'd recompose, and just by the fact that the camera's not refocusing, but just by the fact that I would move my center of my focusing point from the eye to this far, that's just enough to throw the focus off in some cases. And so that's where the Pythagorean comes into play. You got to think about that, because like I said, it'll get you every time. So the solution, I've always used the solution of just using the focus selector to select the different points I want to focus on. If the subject's not moving that much, or using a deeper depth of field, you can overcome that. But if you've watched many of my webinars, I'm really a fan of a shallow depth of field. I want most of the background to be really out of focus. And so when you do that, again, you just got to get accustomed to moving the focus points around where you can adjust them. If you look on the back of this camera I've got right here, this is a Canon 1D Mark III, and I'm doing this backwards, but it has a little dial right there that I can move the focusing point around. And so when I'm taking pictures and using my thumb, I can move the focus point around to where I want it to be, and that way I can compose like the composition. I can move the focusing point around to where I need it to be, and then be able to nail it like that. Now, with mirrorless cameras, they have a situation where they've got the eye tracking, and that's great. But again, since this is mainly focused on DSLRs, you still got to think about that. So if you're center punching your picture and you're getting focus and then recomposing, just that little bit of camera movement may throw your autofocus off a little bit, and your pictures may not appear as sharp as they could be. And that, again, that's one of the things I've constantly got to think about, especially when you're shooting. Like, I don't know if anyone saw it, but the other day I posted some macro pictures I took on my wetland here on my property, and it was of some frogs. And I had my center focusing point established, and the first couple of times I forgot, I'd focus on the frog, recompose, and when I would recompose, because I was shooting at such high magnification, I'd immediately, when I recompose, immediately the frog would be out of focus. So I just had to move the focusing point to where I wanted it. Sue had a question. Perhaps you'll get to this, but I have a Rebel T2i and only have 9 individual focus points to choose from and can't do groups of points. How will that affect sharp focus? Well, let me go back on this. This overlay screen, I'm not even sure which camera it's for. It's just one I got off Canon's website this morning and overlaid in Photoshop on this just to create the illustration. I think that this one approximates like my 1D cameras, but if you have fewer focusing points, a lot of times they'll put those focusing points in the areas where it'll help you with composition. So just pick the one that's closest to the composition that you like and then move it around to that. That's what I would do. And another tip to think about is which focus mode do you use? And I get that question a lot on the trips that we do. And keep in mind, when I talk about focus modes, I'm talking about Canon focus modes. Now, Nikon has a different name for them, as well as Olympus and Sony, and all of them are different names. Hang on one second. We had another question come in. Kathy says, if you keep the focus button halfway down, doesn't that keep it in focus point is before you recompose? Yeah, let me go backwards and talk about that a little bit. I probably didn't make myself clear. So if you in this example here, if you were to focus on the eye, let me use this example. You can see the middle focus point I've got colored red. If you're to focus on the eye using that middle focus point, and then so you have to imagine with me a little bit that middle focus point's over the eye right now. If you're to focus on the eye and hold the shutter button halfway down, that'll lock in the focus. The focus won't move, but just the fact that your camera's moving ever so slightly is changing the distance of the plane from where that camera focused from to your camera sensor. So, and it's minute. I mean, you can notice it more. A good exercise is if you've got a macro lens, put it on and focus on the center and lock that focus down. You can put it in manual focus and focus on one point in the center and then tilt that camera ever so slightly to recompose, and it's going to change your focusing point. So again, my point on this slide is if you focus on the eye, then recompose, it may move that focusing distance just enough because your camera is being tilted at that point. And it's ever so slight. Again, it's fractional, but because your camera is tilting off the plane from which it focused, it's going to change the distance from the focusing plane to the eye of the subject. So my point is, instead of always using the middle point, learn to select the point that's closest to where you're going to learn to use the point that's closest where you're going to actually compose the photo from. And that's a little bit better tip, especially on stuff that's not moving around. Okay, that makes sense, Kathy. And so the next thing is which focus modes to use. And I always tell people it depends on the situation. Again, this is a common question we get on backcountry journeys tours. By the way, most of these pictures you're seeing today were taken on backcountry journey trips. For on stationary subjects, and someone helped me out here, on Canon it's called one shot, and that means it's going to focus once, beat, and not refocus again until you make it refocus. Somebody help me out and tell me what it's called on Canon or Olympus or Sony or something like that. And so stuff that's standing around like this bald eagle just setting stationary, I don't get really excited about it. I use the one-shot mode. If it's moving subjects, I use the AI servo with the center point and the expanded AF with the expanded AF set. And so what that means is it'll focus on the center point primarily, which on my cameras I found is the most accurate, but it'll also select the points immediately around it. And so that way it helps me with my composition. I don't have to dead center punch the animal each time right in the middle to get focus. As long as it's close and I can approximate a composition, it'll go ahead and lock focus on. And autofocus works like this. It works on contrast. The higher the contrast the scene is, the easier it is for it to achieve focus. The lower the contrast, it has a little bit tougher time with it. If you've ever tried to photograph a dark animal against a dark background, you'll know what I mean. So you always try to look for those highlight areas or those points of contrast to focus on, and that's what these cameras do. And so it's like this is a high contrast area. The camera will be able to focus on this quick because the bird's head is white. And so again, when I use AI servo, or I think on Nikon it's called continuous focus, any kind of continuous focus mode, I'm going to use, no matter the camera, I'm going to use on moving subjects like this bald eagle. Then Sue says she's found that switching the back button focus lets me get sharper shots, especially I'll recompose as the focus is locked and independent of the shutter button. And that's true, Sue, but like I said earlier, once you lock that initial focus on, any reshifting of the camera is going to affect the distance because of the Pythagorean Theorem, the a squared, which says the square root of a triangle, or the distance of the leg of the triangle is the square root of a squared plus b squared. Once you change that the shape of that triangle a little bit, in other words, the distance between the focal plane and the subject, and then when you shift the camera just a little bit, if you pre-focus, and you recompose, it's gonna affect ultimately the sharpness of that picture. And again, maybe ever so slight, but it's more pronounced if you're shooting. The closer you get to subjects, and the more you move the camera in that regard. And I'll talk about back button focus in a little bit. And here's some pretty nice high contrast scenes that autofocus does well on. The two flying birds, of course, I use the continuous focus, or AI servo is what it's called in Canon, and then the bald eagle sitting on the tree right there. Super high contrast area. The autofocus will always get it right. And I used one shot there just to make sure it's in focus. I kind of like that audible sound to hear, especially if things are sitting still. I like that just slight beep, which confirms the autofocus. And it just helps kind of me in my mental workflow. Again, if you have any questions or comments as I go along, feel free to jump in. These are just some minor tips that I use every time I go out and take pictures to try to help achieve maximum results. And like I said before, you'll never achieve 100% perfection, but any little thing you can do to improve along the way is sort of what this presentation is about. And so back button focus. Well, I'm still not convinced about that. I use back button focus. I've tried it before. I can't say that I've ever become a big fan of it. I'm gonna retry it again for a couple of reasons, and I'll report back to you later on that, whether I think it's valuable for me or not. It's all a matter of taste, and I'll tell you why. And I'll tell this to a lot of people. I'm not saying back button focus is a bad thing, so don't mishear me when I say that. But for me personally, I like having my finger on the trigger when I'm ready to pull the trigger. So in other words, and that's just how I learned. In other words, I like having my finger on the shutter button when it's time to press the button. Now there are some that'll argue, and they're probably right, that you know, if you're using the same button to autofocus and release the shutter, there's going to be some lag time, and it may be imperceptible lag time, but it's going to take the camera a little bit longer to do all the functions it needs to do to create a well exposed, sharp photo. And so they advocate using the back button, so it's just a completely dedicated button all on its own. But I've just never, because of my habit, I've never gotten used to pushing the button on the back, because my thumb I use, for the most part, I use for exposure lock. I use to check on my camera. I push the button to check which autofocus sensor's live at that time, and then I use it to do exposure compensation and all those other things that I've got my thumb trained to do. But the one thing I've never been able to train it to do is back button focus. But front button focus, it's still going to autofocus. It works well. Again, on this Bears trip, I'm probably going to try some new techniques that I've been thinking about on back button focus and see if it'll help me any at all. I'll let you know on that. I will agree with Jeff's comment here that back button focus is almost essential when shooting underwater. When I shoot underwater, Jeff, I do use back button focus, but above water that I shoot, 99% of the pictures I do, I've just never gotten used to it. But again, I'm open-minded, and I'm willing to give it a try. Dawnette says, focus points, why expanded? What about the center with 4 or more focus points around the center? Yeah, so the expanded autofocus, Dawnette, means that at least on my cameras, you select the center, but if it's close to any of the points that are around it, it'll pick up on those points as well. And so they're different cameras, call them different things. It could be a AF group, and you can, in some more advanced cameras, you can move that group around to different points of the focusing screen inside. But yeah, instead of just focusing on that one point you select, the camera is going to lean towards focusing on that center point, but it's also going to be influenced by the points around it as well. And that's a real good way to set up a camera to be able to capture especially difficult things like birds in flight. Thanks for everybody's comments so far. They've been great. And here's another thing I'll often do. Once I get a camera, I'll make fine adjustments. You can go into all these cameras menus, and they've got different ways to set different things. Now, this is just a picture of the back of my camera that I took as I was preparing for this presentation. And so there's all kinds of different things you can set. I'm just going to grab my camera real quick and give you, for example, on the autofocus and drive setting on mine, it allows me to set everything from whether the back button focus works or not, like we talked about. And I did. That's why I was messing with my camera this morning as I was preparing for this and thinking about this webinar, is setting up for the back button focus and making sure that I knew how to turn it on or off. And then, it's got everything else. I can set the tracking sensitivity on my AI servo. So in other words, how sensitive is the autofocus to the tracking? I can set, whether the camera will go off or not if autofocus is not achieved. All kinds of things you can go in and customize. And I'm not going to give you a workflow as far as what you should customize and what you shouldn't customize, because that's kind of different for everybody. A lot of these lenses, you can even go in and make micro adjustments to the autofocus. So if you, and I usually don't wade into the weeds this heavily when it comes to my lenses. I really feel like the way they come off the shelf, they're sharp enough. But if you really, one of those guys that really likes the technical side of photography and wants to tinker with everything, you can actually focus your lenses on a focusing chart and make micro fine adjustments to how that lens focuses. And the camera will remember it each time you pick it up and use it. And so that's another thing you do. I always go through, when I get a new camera, I try to set up all my cameras the same. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 different camera bodies that I've got in my arsenal. I'll only use 1 or 2 at any given time, but of the 5 or 6, they're all set up basically the same, so that when I put a lens on the next one, they'll all operate in a similar manner without me having to rethink it each time. And so look through your menus, figure out what fine adjustments work for you and which ones don't work for you. The beautiful thing about the internet and YouTube is, if you don't understand something, and there was something about my camera I didn't understand this morning, pop on YouTube. Someone else has made a video about it. It helps me understand it a whole lot better. But again, I encourage you to look through the menu and find those fine tuning points that you can do on the autofocus. And again, none of these are one magic bullet to help it be better, but I think it's incremental changes that you can make in your workflow that once all those incremental changes kind of add up, then it's going to make a difference in how you do things. And this next one is one of those things a lot of people don't think about, and it makes a huge difference, especially when you're doing birds in flight photography. It makes a huge difference on the number of keepers that you'll have. And that is use the focus limiter on your camera, on your lens, I mean. And what that focus limiter is, and again, this is all anecdotal, and I don't know if this applies to this crowd or not that's listening, but a lot of times when I talk about this on backcountry journeys trips, a lot of people didn't realize their lens would do this. But if you look, it looks something like this switch you see on this slide here. There's you basically got 3 adjustments to your lens. You can set it to full, in which that means it's going to do the full focusing range from however close the lens will focus. Like my big 500 millimeter lens, I think will focus from about 3 meters away. So 3 meters all the way out to infinity, that's the full range. And then the middle setting you can see on this particular lens, I think this was the Tamron 150 to 400 millimeter lens that I found this picture of the focus limiter. The 10 millimeter to infinity range is just that. It'll focus from 10 millimeters out to infinity. And then the last one, the 2.8 to 10 millimeters, is kind of that middle range that it'll focus. Now, on birds in flight, I do the 10 millimeter to infinity. And if you look at your lenses, I'm going to show you an old 200 millimeter lens I have. If you look at that scale right there and you kind of dial through it, like this one has a focus limiter of 3 meters to infinity. If you go from, if I can show you this, if you go from here, and you got to twist it a bunch to get to 3 meters, which is about right there. I almost had to twist it 2 times around. But from 3 meters to infinity is about 1 twist around. And so most of the focus travel on this lens, and this is a 70 to 200 2.8, most of the focus travel on this lens is going to be from the close-up range to that 3 meters. Or on this particular lens here that you're seeing on the screen, most of the focusing travel will be from close up to 10 meters away. And so from 10 meters to infinity is relatively little bit of travel range that the lens has to move to obtain autofocus. And the point of these focusing limiters is when you set that and you're shooting, again, like birds in flight, that camera, that lens doesn't have to move nearly as much to obtain focus. And so what you find is you get a lot more pictures in focus because your camera is not having to hunt for autofocus continually. And so that focusing limiter, that's one of those big things. You know, everything I talked about before are all incremental changes in how to use your autofocus. This one right here was going to make a huge difference, especially if you're doing birds in flight or animals moving around. Even a deer running around out in the field, if he's 40 yards away, there's no point in allowing your lens to focus 3 meters away, because if it picks up a limb or a weed or something in between, it may try to refocus. So set your focusing limiter, and then again, a lot of your pictures are going to be will be a lot sharper and a lot more of them in focus. And as usual, I like sharing videos on these things. So I'm going to show you a video that this is the world premiere. So if we see any mistakes in it, I didn't catch them quick enough. So this is the world premiere of a new video that I just made last night. And it is, I shot it a while back, so let me switch over here. I shot it a while back, but here you go. This is one in birds in flight. And this talks a little bit about, it's a short video, but it talks a little bit about how to set up your camera and doing all these things we're talking about to ensure that you get a. So I'm here at the 10,000 Island National Wildlife Refuge in southern Florida. And all around me, there's birds all over this wetland. And right now, they're pretty much stationary, but as the day goes on, they're going to start flying around. And one of the most dynamic ways to capture bird behavior is to take pictures of birds in flight. And if you've never tried it before, you got to give it a try. And really, it's a lot easier than what you think. If you'll follow a set of basic rules, you'll be off to taking great birds in flight photography in no time. Oh, there's a mistake there. I forgot to add music to that part. So the first thing I'll do is get my camera set up right. On my lens, which is a 500mm f4 lens, I'm going to set the focusing limiter on. What that does, it allows the lens to only focus from like half range all the way to the end instead of being able to rack through the whole focusing range. And that will save you time as your lens hunts for autofocus. The second thing I'm going to do, I prefer to set my camera on aperture priority, and then I just adjust with exposure compensation and set my aperture accordingly from there. I'm going to shoot my camera in burst mode so I can take a lot of pictures at one time. And then I'm going to set my ISO probably between 400 and 800 depending on the light. And then I'll set my focus point on the middle point. Some of these newer cameras like this Canon R5 will pick up focus wherever it goes, but on my older cameras the middle focusing point seems to be the most accurate, and that's the one I like to set. The second thing, of course, with wildlife photography is just be patient. Whenever I'm taking pictures of birds in flight, one of the things I'm doing is I'm looking for birds that are coming from way out. And you know, it may be really active and there may be birds flying all around you, but don't get distracted by all the birds around you. Pick a bird a long way out and track that one bird until it comes all the way in. And so what I'll do is as I track that bird as it comes in, when it gets to be in decent photographic range, I'll start taking pictures and really reserve the buffer on my camera before I lay down on the shutter till he gets really close where he starts to land to really get that good action. And that brings me to my last point. Take lots and lots and lots of pictures. You know, bird and flight photography is kind of a hit and miss affair. Sometimes you'll get it right, a lot of times you won't, but you got to just keep taking pictures over and over again. So when I'm out taking pictures, I may have 1 out of every 4 that I think are keepers. Some of them I may clip a wing off because I don't have good composition. Others may be a little bit out of focus. Others, the exposure may be a little bit off, but either way, I take lots and lots and lots of pictures. So even though I'm going to throw 3 of them away, that number 4 one may be the keeper. Yeah, so again, on that video, the takeaway on that is goes back to the last slide we just did. Is the this is the use that focus limiter. That if you've never used that before, try it out. And again, I don't always encourage people. There's plenty of stuff in our own backyards that we can photograph, from songbirds to dogs running around to your cat or whatever. But just try out things like the focus limiter early on before you go on the trip. And really just try to get some of these techniques mastered before you head into the field. And it'll save you a lot of frustration. And really the main thing in the end, it'll save you a lot of, it'll help increase your satisfaction of the trip, just because it will, you'll have a lot more keepers when you're done. And you've heard me say this time and time again, use a tripod. Now I noticed one name in the group. I'm not going to call you out by name, but he was with me on a trip, and I don't know what happened to it, but I was using my tripod in Yellowstone National Park, and I think I'm going to blame Bigfoot for taking it, because my tripod went missing. And this was the Gitzo legs and the gimbal head, and it's a tripod I've had forever, and I'm taking really good care of it. And so it looks like it was brand new, but now I don't have that tripod anymore. But I've since replaced that tripod. But the main thing is use a tripod. You know, these camera systems are becoming super advanced these days. You've got lens stabilization and you've got in-body stabilization. But all of that combined, there's going to be times when there's not enough. And so being able to use a tripod and being familiar with one and being able to get one out, get it set up quick, and be able to use it consistently, you're going to see that this may be one of the biggest things you can do in your photography to see immediate and lasting results. You know, I see it every trip we go on. Someone is having problems with the sharpness of their pictures, and I'll tell them, start using your tripod, see if it makes any difference at all, and almost immediately it makes a difference. So usually it's not, especially when you're in that learner mode and that discovery mode in photography, it's usually not the equipment that's the problem, and it's not always the person. You may have a good understanding of exposure and how that works, but even the slightest amount of movement, if the situations are right, is going to affect the sharpness of your pictures. And so if you can use a tripod, you can take at least that variable out of it. And then it helps you try to figure out if your pictures still aren't sharp, if you're using proper shutter speed, a tripod, and then you've got your lens optimized for autofocus. Using a tripod will help you sort of isolate what the problem may be over and over. Most of the time when I have pictures that aren't sharp, it's because it's the problem is me. It's ultimately I'm trying to push my camera way beyond the limits of what it's possible to do just to try to get shots. And that's okay. You know, again, I equated photography to golf, to use that analogy again. You know, sometimes you're going to hit a bogey, but you just love the game enough to keep trying and trying. And so that's why if usually the problem is with anything, it's with me. But again, tripods go a long way in helping that. Glenn Allen asked the picture, why use aperture mode for birds in flight with a fixed ISO and exposure compensation? I like to use manual mode setting aperture to the fastest setting, shutter around 1/2000 or so, plus auto ISO. Can you comment on pluses and minuses of each approach? You know, in Texas, Glenn, we got a saying, maybe not just in Texas, but this is where I grew up and this is where I hear it. There's a million different ways to skin a cat. And, you know, a lot of the reasons I use aperture priority is because it's the reason I justify is because one, that's the way I learned. And number two, I can just operate the camera a lot quicker because of that. I can look at a picture and I can look at a scene a lot of times and be able to determine if the camera is going to underexpose it or overexpose it. And I can make exposure. I can do my exposure adjustments accordingly. And so I can just work quicker like that. Now the way you're setting it up on manual mode, I'll shoot a fair number of birds in flight in manual mode. But especially if the background changes a lot from light to dark and it's going to fool the camera. But on the exposure compensation on just kind of a middle tone subject works usually most of the time for me. And again, that just takes out, if I let the camera decide the shutter speed and I set the ISO and the aperture, then that's one less thing I have to think about to set. Now, the one thing that you do mention I'm not a fan of, and this is just because of my sensibilities, I know you can limit the auto ISO, but I'm not a fan of auto ISO just because I'd prefer to set that one because that's a direct the ISO is going to have a direct effect on the way my images look. And so that's why I mentioned in the video, my sweet spot's usually between 400 and 800. I think that's where my cameras perform the best. I mean, obviously a little bit lower would be better, but 400 and 800 is kind of the optimal results for me. And I can get the shutter speeds I want to do birds in flight. And then again, by using a tripod, like I mentioned in this slide, it helps you track the birds a little better and you can track them a little smoother and more steady. And then sometimes you can get by with slower shutter speeds than 1/2000th of a second. I've shot them at 1/500th of a second and 1/250th of a second and everything in between. Like, let me back up and I'll show you. You can't hardly see it, but that picture of the egret in the upper right there, that was a pretty slow shutter speed. I shot that. In fact, if you looked at it up close, the background has a little bit of motion blur, but I shot it on tripod and was able to steady it otherwise. But so your technique is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Again, it's just a matter of taste and a matter of kind of workflow and how you like to do things. And me, I just prefer, because of speed, using aperture priority and exposure compensation on top of that, and then setting the ISO for what I want it to. Now with your setup, to expand a little bit further on that, let me read through this again. The manual mode I like. The 2,000th of a second is fine if but the auto ISO, and again, I think the plus of your setting is the fact that it's the plus of yours is it's gonna, the camera, if you're set for correct exposure and the light doesn't change, the exposure is not going to change. The only thing, again, like auto ISO, I've just never been a fan of auto ISO at all. And if you can limit it between 400 and 800, which I know you can, I just soon go ahead and set it manually anyway. I hope that makes sense. And then the last slide is any questions or comments so far from anybody else? Like I said, you guys had a lot of great comments today, and I really appreciate that. Well, while we're talking through that, and if anyone's typing, I'll go ahead and put this in. Just be sure to stay in touch, as always. There's my website address, or you can send me an email directly at russell@russellgraves.com. You know, if you send a question or comment within the next day or two, I'll be sure to answer it. But if it's after Friday, just know that I'll be in the wilderness with a limited amount of technology, and I may or may not see that email for a while. But again, this webinar today, we're going to end it a little bit early, just because it wasn't, you know, I'm a big advocate of telling everybody that when it comes to camera stuff, it's not rocket science. I mean, it's just a matter of muscle memory and learning whatever path that you need to get to your optimal results. It's just learning that path and just staying consistent over and over and over and over again. You know, one of the things I mention a lot to people in these workshops is, I know my camera will do a lot more than I ever use it for, but the fact is, if I need to use some of those extra techniques, I'll go into it. But most wildlife photography, you can get there with a minimal amount of camera settings. You can do some of these pictures with a minimal amount of settings. And so what I'm an advocate of like Glenn, learning what that technique that you're comfortable with, that'll get you from point A to point B, and just becoming comfortable in that and letting muscle memory take over and doing the same things over and over and over again. You know, one of the things I like to pride myself on is the ability to pick up my camera and be able to shoot pictures within just a couple of seconds, and I don't have to think about it. And I don't think about it because I'm not overcomplicating things, and I never try to overcomplicate things when it comes to photography stuff. So as you watch these webinars, whether it's this one or any other one, you'll notice it's a kind of a simplistic approach, and I'm not doing to try to dumb it down for anybody. I do it because that's the way I think about photography. You know, there's a lot of complexity that people will put on the web to try to make things super complex. But the truth is, I think most of us want to go out and enjoy nature and come back with some great photos. And if that's your goal, then there's nothing that should be so complex that it frustrates you to go do something like that. So that's why I try to take the complexity out of it and try to tell you just honestly, it's just a simple steps of A, B, C, and D. And if you can get those simple steps down in your mind and do them time and time and time again, you may miss a few shots, but your keeper rate will go way, way up. And I had a few what I was on my monologue there, I had a few comments come in. Thanks, Sue. Thanks for your comments there. That's great. Thanks, Rick, on that. Steve asked the question, do you use a gimbal head or a ball head for birds in flight? I use a gimbal head. Just, again, personal preference. I've used ball heads before, but the reason why I like the gimbal head is in case, and this comes back to my shortcomings, in case I forget to lock the knob down, my gimbal head's just going to stay there when I let it go. And so I don't have to worry about locking down each time. And then Bill asked the question, using the tripod, are you panning to catch the bird, or are you waiting for the bird to enter the frame? I'm usually panning, using the same technique. If I see them coming for a ways, like I mentioned in the video, on birds in flight, I'll tend to look for them while they're way out and track the same bird coming in and just maintain fidelity to that one animal. You know, again, when we were at and again, I've noticed some names in the group today that were at that 10,000 Islands when I filmed that video that day. But and you can ask them, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of birds around us. There were birds everywhere. And it's kind of overwhelming when you're trying to do birds in flight. But pick one and stick with it till you can't take pictures of it anymore. And that's usually what I do. So to finish my point, Bill, I'll pick that bird early and try to, using a tripod, try to get the tracking down so I can compose it correctly and get the speed down. And then you'll be amazed once you just use that technique in a camera on a tripod and be able to track its speed. You'll be amazed at how slow a shutter speed you can do birds in flight down to 1/30th of a second by using that technique. Thank you, Hazel, for listening in. Lynette says, thanks so much. Super helpful. Appreciate you going on my website and looking at my work. It's a labor of love, and I tell this to everyone all the time. I have been blessed. I've been making my living as a professional photographer mainly a magazine and a commercial photographer for the past, making most of my living for the past 20 years, making my full-time living for the past 12 years. And it's been blessed. When you can press a button on a camera and someone finds value in the things that you create like that, it's always a blessing, and I never take it for granted. And that's why goes back to my first slide. You guys are talking to the entire photography enthusiast community of Dodge City, Texas. And so anytime someone wants to talk photography and learn about photography, I am always in to share that with them. So again, feel free to follow up with me if you thought of something after this webinar is over. If you have any further questions, always look forward to hearing everybody's questions and comments. And I really look forward to seeing people in the field and getting to meet some of the folks that are going to be in Alaska with us, not only in this week, but also coming up or Alaska and elsewhere coming up in the fall. So always look forward to it, guys. I appreciate it. I don't think I've got any more questions or comments coming in. Thanks again for your attentiveness. Thanks again for your questions and comments, and for the ones I've met. Thanks again for your continued friendship. You guys take care.